Hey everybody, it's Jack Murphy. You are back on the Jack Murphy Live Podcast, the flagship podcast of the Liminal Order. You can find me all over the internet at Jack Murphy Live, especially on Twitter, also on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, all the rest. My headquarters is the jackmurphylive.com website. Come on down there, check out all the podcasts, blog posts. There's like 100 of them. Sign up for the mailing list, get involved. All right, that brings us to today's guest, Jordan Hall. He is a former tech CEO turned philosopher who is working to solve some of the biggest problems we face today. I first discovered him when I read his essay called Situational Assessment 2015, where he explained his idea of the blue church and the red religion, which we then covered extensively in the first podcast that we did together back in February of 2019. That podcast was packed with such great information and new ideas that many listeners have called it transformational for them. In fact, his work in general was transformational on me too. I cite Jordan heavily in my book, Democrat to Deplorable, and our first conversation was part of what inspired me to create the Liminal Order. In this new podcast, Jordan and I just jump right into things with little background information, so I highly recommend going back to the older podcast and listening to that one first. We also mentioned the Liminal Order several times, and if you're interested in learning what that's all about, head over to liminalorder.com. That's liminal-order.com and see what we're all about. But without further ado, I present to you part 2 with Jordan Hall. Hey, it's great to see you, Jordan. How are you doing today? And thanks for coming back on the show. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Your report of the last show that left me feeling like it was a really good idea to spend time in the last show. So I'm looking forward to seeing what happens this time.
I really appreciate that. So people know, after our last show, a lot of things have happened, and I thought that that podcast interview that we did was very inspiring, and we'll get into some of that stuff later. But I decided to just sort of write an email to you that laid it all out, and so I just threw it out there. I felt like I was taking a little bit of a risk. I didn't know how you might react, but I'm glad that it was well received positively, and I'm really looking forward to continuing some of those conversations that we had on the last one and sort of pushing a little bit further forward as well.
Yeah. I'm actually noticing that there's already something like a moral lesson in what you just said that talks about how there's it's so funny. I almost feel like it's a nostalgia for a possibility of people being willing to take a bit of a risk.
Mm-hmm.
And the degree to which individuals are able to perceive the reality of that, and by the way, not the simulation of that, which we should be very careful about, and then to respond honorably to that.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
I think that ends up being a very important piece of the bigger story. It's just that simple thing.
Well, that's exactly the context that I see it in. And, just so we're not being super vague, Jordan and I last spoke, I think, back in February of 2019, and it is now September 12th. And since then, I had these things formulating in terms of the sort of men's community that put self-improvement at its focus within the context of the blue church crumbling and the red religion rising and our difficulties in understanding each other and the world around us. And Jordan's conversation put it into a historical context for me that I had not previously considered. And after our talk, I put it all together and we took a risk and we created a community based around the notion that we were experiencing, never seen before change that you have qualified as being as difficult to overcome as becoming human was in the first place. Once in a 100,000 million year, 10 million year event, and sort of take those ideas and put them together from the highest abstract level and try to distill it down to something that we could do on a concrete basis. With that as the sort of framework, I reached out to, the audience and the community to see if there would be people who would be interested in organizing around those ideas and then trying to figure out the best way to move forward and to become sort of the best citizens and parents and fathers and brothers and community members that we could be, with this sort of larger goal, even if it is very very distant and something that's way off in the on the horizon. But there's no time like the present, and all of those big changes are made by little incremental steps along the way. And so we did it, man. We launched. We've got over 100 members. We've got a very active community. We've got people focused on self-improvement and understanding the world and discussions around these issues that you and I have touched on. And you were hugely inspirational in that. And I know all the guys in the order are really looking forward to this podcast, as well as thousands of other people too. So again, thank you, because you helped me crystallize the vision and put it into a larger context. And I'm hoping to get some feedback from you on that, sort of in how the whole system works, and also follow up on some other questions that I had from before. But, that's sort of the direction that I wanted to move in, and to hear what you've been up to too, because, you've definitely been out there, and I've seen a lot of new content from you. It looks like a lot of interviews and stuff too. So I'm curious to hear how your thinking has been evolving and what you're up to, and, what your latest narratives and stories are as they always continue to evolve in this sort of iterative process that we're all in here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, just the thing that popped into my head, there's obviously a lot, but in a moment I hope we actually just can get into the meat of the thing, because I'm looking forward to finding out what happens there. But yeah, in terms of the reality, the fact that I find myself in some number of podcasts, maybe, I don't know, one every 2 weeks or so now, I have a strong antipathy to the entire discipline of marketing and the entire category of propaganda. And I intentionally and knowingly, therefore, in some ways, blunting my own edge, but I intentionally don't have an intent when I come into this kind of a conversation.
Right.
I do not know that I have ever once reached out to anyone to try to be on a podcast. I'm always responding to people coming in.
Yeah.
And generally my filter is, if the individual who's coming in feels to me like they are in earnest, they are trying to do well, and have some reasonable capacity to do so, right? They're both in earnest and somewhat competent in being earnest, I will say yes. And then also I will endeavor to simply play with them in their milieu, right? So I may find myself in a circumstance where I'm having a conversation that is frankly very far from the kinds of conversations that I typically have, or that I'd be particularly interested in. But that's okay. That's fine.
That it just caused me to think about a ton of different things that you had said about how to. We're going to jump all over the place. We might as well just go for it, right? Just ride the wave, right? In previous things that I've heard you say, and in the stuff that I just reviewed, you were talking about the emergent decentralized intelligence networks. And for anybody who's listening now, please just go back and listen to the first one so you can get caught up on that. And one of the questions that I had written here is, how do you guide a decentralized network? And given what you just said about sort of your initiative to respond and to participate and to lend your horsepower and thinking and history and experience to these ongoing conversations, can I sort of deduce that that's one of the ways that you think it's possible to help participate or guide or shape, or how do you lead a non-leaderless thing, etc.?
This is something I've been thinking about a lot. And in fact, just before we recorded, we talked about the fact that I got to go out and have coffee and a walk with my wife for the first time in 10 months. We have a 10-month-old baby. And it's actually exactly what we were talking about. This is, we got together on the basis of that kind of a question, which is a somewhat odd, romantic basis, but that's how it happened. We were both working on something called Game B. And this is a deep question, of how do you lead a leaderless thing? How do you guide a decentralized system? And, I apologize because a little bit of the language that's going to come out of my mouth is maybe going to sound a little bit both abstract and maybe a bit brainy. But maybe we can continue to try to keep it grounded and concrete. But this is very much cutting edge for me. Like I'm really contemplating this deeply. Yeah, it feels like actually there's two different modes of answering that question. And the word mode here is like qualitatively distinct epistemological bases for even contemplating a question. So two almost different epistemologies. So one epistemology is what we might call embodiment. That the way you lead a leaderless thing is you simply live it as best you can in yourself. Not with an intent of showing up in a way that is a model, but actually out of complete humility to recognize that everybody is learning and trying to learn, and you are also learning. And so your job is just to try to do it and to become it, to become the thing that is emerging, which is a whole task. And I think if you enter into that principle of humility and also a principle of not knowing, the thing will begin to show up through you in some deep sense. And then you're in a place where you can begin to have. So this conversation, right? The fact that you took a risk and you shared a certain level of intimacy and vulnerability in your email to me. And then the way for me to respond to that is to listen and say, wow, that's coming from real integrity and courage. And the right way to respond to integrity and courage is to honor it and to say, okay, so now I'm almost being called to step into that and say, okay, what does it mean for me to collaborate with that same quality of energy? And that's just living it. Like I'm just trying to live the thing. And as I'm living the thing, that just means that my choices moment to moment are going to have a certain quality to them. And I should note that from that mode, I think it's important for people to be very clear on the proposition that for a human being to embody a way of being completely, more or less requires that it has been the complete context of their development. Meaning the culture that we're talking about trying to build won't really be realized for 2 or 3 generations hence. We are trying to give rise to something that we almost certainly won't actually live to experience or very well much. And that's, I think, is just the nature of where we are. Like that's the role that it is ours to play. We're planting the trees. We're not going to be sitting under their shade, at least not much. And I think it's important to really hold that and acknowledge that and then use that as a way of guiding our own choices. So that's from the mode of an embodied way of being. Then from the mode of, theory, there's something like when you're trying to design for emergence, when you're trying to cultivate or catalyze the autopoietic, the theory points in the direction of things that we might call principles or meta-principles. The actual technical terms are things like enabling and selecting constraints. There's a philosopher of science named Alicia Guerrero who first introduced me to these concepts. John Vervaeke has been using the terms in his ongoing series as a practical part of what he's doing. But the point is to have a way of orienting our choices with, again, principles that, what's the right way of putting this? I'm trying to say it. There's a way that I would say this that is very sort of Daniel Schmachtenberger. Lots of syllables. I'm trying to figure out how to not say it with lots of syllables. Damn. Well, let me just give you some examples. So, a meta principle is what I just articulated. So, the meta principle of embodied way of being. It's like, okay, well, shoot, that really does simplify a lot of my choices. That if in doubt, reflect on how can I just live the thing, as opposed to say, how can I try to think about the thing or plan the thing. So that's a meta principle. Another meta principle might be something like, this thing is the kind of thing that is, you can't plan it. You can't strategize it. And no one person or even small group is going to be meaningfully responsible for it. And so what ends up happening is the meta principle for, say, for me or for you on purpose it's actually kind of a neat thing. It's you almost certainly have a particular piece of the bigger story that is precisely yours. And your job is, in some sense, threefold. First, stop carrying that which is not yours to carry. I find that lots and lots of people, and probably for quite good reasons, endeavor to do more than that is in fact theirs to do. Largely because they can't find other people to carry those parts, and oftentimes they need a whole bunch to get anything done. Well, become more and more skillful at not doing that. Be careful to carry less and less of what is not yours to do. Of course, the corollary to that is really fully carry that which is yours to do. And by that I mean both to suss it out, to really sense the parameters and the shape and the characteristics of why you're here. What is your unique capacity in the context of the larger story? And become masterful at it, like 100% commitment. And I mean 100%, no compromise. Doing whatever is necessary in yourself to make yourself capable of fully bringing into the world that aspect of the bigger story that is your responsibility. So that's another meta principle. And so you can see that there's these two meta principles really shape a lot of the kinds of choices. They provide like a high level context, but they don't give any particularities. Again, what the answer to those questions are for me are up to me. Like I've got to kind of figure that out. And the answer to those questions for you are up to you, and you're going to have to figure it out. And then I can take it to a lower level. All right. So now what are the enabling and selecting constraints? What are the principles that make it easier for me to engage in those kinds of principles? Those meta principles. So, well, how do I go about finding out what is mine to do? And how do I go about becoming capable of doing it? So here at principles level, we actually now have, so I apologize again profusely for the level of cognitive complexity in what it is I'm trying to say, and emphasize trying to say. I have not yet been able to do the work of actually converting this into something that is both true and relatively easy. So this is sausage making. But now what I'm doing is I'm trying to move from the point of a meta principle into a principle, which is kind of like a heuristic or a rule of thumb or a guide or an enabler to help you actually live through this. So in the context of how do I discover that which is mine to do, there's a principle, which is really interesting actually now that I think about it. I'm not sure how much of what I'm experiencing right now actually is an interesting design element. What I'm noticing is that there's actually the embodiment, the notion of embodiment and becoming this kind of person. The more you're able to use your most full self, the more you're able to become whole, the more you're able to heal. And we can go into that in particular, but so the principle would be heal thyself. Before know thyself, heal thyself. Mm-hmm. That would be a principle. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is, because we have not actually been developed, immersed up to our heels in a culture that truly supports our being who we are, and therefore being capable of doing what we are, we're broken in many ways. So we have bad habits that showed up because our developmental environment put us in a context where we developed coping and adaptive strategies that were the best that we could develop then, but those have kind of become locked in, and now we're using sort of 6-year-old capacities to solve 50-year-old problem. or at some point in time, we adopted a particular set of cognitive frameworks that happened to either seem really good at the time or were imposed upon us at the time. And those are sort of sunk into unconsciousness, and we're using them even though they're not the right tool for the job. Those kinds of things. Like there's lots and lots of stuff under that heading. But the reality is that our developmental environment, quite frankly, sucked. I mean, we haven't had a thing that has really supported our capacity to be fully able to just use our wholeness of self to figure shit out. So one principle is, all right, go back, look backwards and figure out how to undergo all the various practices that can support becoming whole. And that's the root word of healing, right? To heal is simply to become whole. To recover the wholeness of yourself, to recover your whole body, and to bring your whole body to bear in the moment. And to recover your whole mind, to bring your whole mind to bear in the moment. And for that matter, even to recover your relationships, and to be able to bring the qualities of your relationships as an extension of yourself into the moment. And what I've noticed, and I can say this with some confidence, that the question of sussing out and becoming very clear on what is yours to do, it's principally something that is only answerable by that instrument, by the wholeness of yourself. Yeah. If your instrument is well tuned, if your self has been made whole, and then you spent some time learning how to then allow that wholeness of self to respond to questions and noticing how answers come up, then that instrument is the instrument to answer the question of what is mine to do. So that would be an application of a principle that would then help to answer the meta principles. Wow, that was a lot. I hope it was even vaguely comprehensible or useful.
No, I mean, it's wonderful. It reminded me of, I was listening to a conversation. I guess you said his name was John. How do you spell his last name?
Vervaeke.
Vervaeke. Yeah. And I think it was in that conversation where you were talking about the difference between learning between proposition and transformation or experience. I was just reminded of that as you were speaking there. And maybe if you could talk a little bit about that, sort of the process of becoming, and that becoming is the understanding, or, it wasn't entirely clear to me there. And then if you could also maybe tie that in with, I have gotten the strong sense from you that you have an extreme faith in human capability. But at the same time, you're proposing, or you're saying that we're experiencing these problems, which seem to be bigger than us, as big as humans, as big as human existence. And I'm wondering about how, or where that faith comes from, or why you seem so confident that we as individuals have it within us to sort of solve these big problems that you seem to say are bigger than ourselves. So, I don't know if all that is related, but it is sort of, it was what was bouncing around in my head just then.
Nice. Well, yeah, I think we can almost do that in a two-step process, because the second question really opens up a lot for the first. So, John actually, I think, has a way of saying it that I like, which is in terms of what he calls participatory knowing. Which is also at the foundation. He speaks to this also, a term that he uses is relevance realization, which is very, as far as I know, his own personal or private term, but it's the basis. It's like the anchor or the root or the ground from which everything else comes. So if you're thinking about things, the thinking that you're doing is happening on the foundation of your relevance realization machinery, which is to say on the foundation of your quality of being in the world, your participatory knowing. And so there's a very practical orientation towards that. It's kind of like just get your feet square if you want to do something. Get your sense of balance solid before you do the next thing. And so one piece of the notion of participatory knowing is actually dispositional. It's a choice to allow yourself to be transformed by the relationship you're entering into. So we can imagine that, if you and I were having a debate, we're having a debate at a distance. There's a lot of protection and a lot of distinction And very little, almost by definition, I am not making myself vulnerable and opening myself up to be transformed by the relationship. I mean, even in some sense, the whole point is, in fact, we're not even in relationship. We're endeavoring to not be in a relationship in some deeply formal sense.
Right.
So participatory knowing is the exact opposite. It is, okay, we're entering into a relationship where there's a deep commitment to uncertainty. I don't know. I know I don't know. And I sense that I will continue to grow in a capacity to have some portion of knowing become part of me. Not as an idea, but as actually as a change in myself, a change in my, like my attitudes or my habits or my behaviors or the kind of the deep assumptions that I'm making about the nature of possibility or of reality. And so there's a cultivated epiphany is a thing that you might notice where you're in a relationship of participatory knowing. And we see this, like, there's a that sounds very august, but it's actually very simple when you think about it just in terms of embodied practice. Like if you're trying to learn Aikido or you're trying to learn Tango, you're engaging in participatory knowing. Like if I actually had a great experience of trying to learn how to golf. And my friend's dad, I was young, my friend's dad was a really good, like, pro golfer. And he explained golf to me in propositional knowing, in words, right? So I had a whole bunch of notions in my head. And I don't know if you've ever done any kind of sporting learning of that sort, but if you have, and I know most people have, there's a very known common experience that ain't worth shit. You get down there and you try to swing the golf club and you realize that every single word gets completely in the way.
Right.
And the thing to do is just to do it. And that as you're doing it, and by the way, if you're doing it with someone else, like dancing, if you've ever taken dance lessons, and you and your partner, like, you and your partner are both taking dance lessons, and you're not very good at it, and you're trying, and then the dance teacher, she steps in, and she's really good at it. And you notice that, oh my God, it's so much easier because she's really good at it. And because it's so much easier, there's a way for you to almost like relax into it. And there's just things that you absorb into yourself. And it's an increase in capacity that happens at the basic level that you're not thinking about. And any degree to which you're thinking about is just getting in the way. So that's the essence of a really good example of participatory knowing. And by the way, is a good example of the notion of what I was trying to refer to as embodiment. That even when we're talking about things that are fundamentally intellectual, at the end of the day, it's still going to be 85% embodiment. And we can go into that if you'd like, but that's really important to recognize. So, given that, now let's talk about the second question as an example. So let's enter into the second question as a zone of inquiry, as a shared space of uncertainty and a feeling into the mystery. So, I mean, in reality, I find myself always both daunted and tickled by the paradox, which is to say, I'm deeply cynical about humanity, deeply disappointed in myself, in others.
In your behavior or in your cynicism?
In my capacity.
Okay.
And in my behavior as a result of my capacity. When I look at the magnitude of the challenges that we are facing, and of course, to almost 100%, they're all of our making, right? So we are responsible for our own circumstances. And then I look at the constant degree to which human beings avoid, delude, dissemble, have a lack of care, project. I mean, oh my God, the litany of vices that one can assign to the human species, of which I guess in some very fortunate sense I am a very strong example, is high. It's large. And so let us not be even the least bit false about that. But it's a paradox because, okay, let's take off the shit-colored glasses and put on the rose-colored ones. There's also a grandness and a possibility and a beauty and constant moments of surprise and delight and awe-inspiring genius and kindness. And we are, in fact, responsible for our circumstances. And here we stand at the precipice of enormous possibility. And in fact, to be perfectly frank, I am oftentimes astounded at my own capacity to get up and shake off and step back into hopefulness and commitment to simply both forgive myself for my vices and choose to grow in my virtues. And this is true of many people, my wife not least of all. And so it's just a paradox.
Yeah.
And it just kind of sits there. And I think that creates the right space, like the space of humility and the space of awe, as well as the space of responsibility. I think that's the disposition, like to be able to sit right in the tension of the paradox may be the right way to really be in relationship to the moment.
A lot of times I think I've heard you say that part of the way to move forward is to look backwards and to look back into what I think you've called poetic mythology, the sort of archetypal stories and such. And then a lot of the things you're describing are just remind me of just focusing and recentering and, allowing yourself to become sort of in the moment and more mindful. It's interesting to me that part of the prescription to move forward into the scary new future is to look backwards and to try to reconnect with or enhance some of our more traditional methods of self-improvement or focus or attention or, tuning the instrument. I think I've heard you say, also referring to us as instruments in the system. What do you make of that? Like, how did that get stripped away from us? Or are all of us looking back that way? Was it willful? Was this an emergent thing that just happened by accident? That maybe we've, the past answers have been a little bit obscured. Is it nefarious? Is it just an accident?
Well, yeah, first what I'd like to just sort of point out is that I think we're in a really good place right now. And I'm taken by the fact that in a very odd way, the conversation I have with my wife is mirroring this conversation step by step. That was literally the very next thing that came up.
Wow.
So let's see. Her name is Vanessa, by the way. So I'll refer to her as Vanessa in the future.
Yeah.
She's very vastly more meaningful than just as my wife.
Right. No.
So in that conversation, one of the things that we really settled on was to recognize both the past and the future. And I think, again, it's important to hold both. And it's to be really centered in the center of that. I almost feel like there's like two rings. One ring that's coming from the past and loops around the present. Another ring that comes from the future and loops around the present. And they're both kind of pulling on each other. And we sit very much in the center of that. And there's a way of being in right relationship with both directions. Which is to say that there's actually a certain error in the archaic. So there's a right relationship with the past, and there's a wrong relationship with the past. There is no returning, nor is it appropriate or necessary to endeavor to return to the past. Yet at the same time, there's a recovering or remembering and a reconciling with all of that, which is our the nature in human nature. And I want to really emphasize that because a lot of this is actually also reconnecting with nature and with the natural. So what's happened here? A few moments ago, you mentioned the notion or the proposition that I've been making that the moment that we find ourselves in is more or less of the same order of magnitude as that which separated humans from the rest of nature. The thing that made us Homo sapiens, human in the human nature. And so perhaps it's worthwhile even settling on that moment, because that's a bit of the answer to the question that you were just posing. Something happened, and it seems actually to be reasonable to say about 100,000 years ago, something in the upper Paleolithic transition, as John calls it out in the beginning of his series. Something happened where humans found a way to become asymmetric to the rest of nature, to the rest of our ecosystem. Our capacity to learn, our capacity to engage in abstraction, to be able to look at a stone and have a sense of the notion of sharpness separate from a particular example of it, and therefore to be able to begin to optimize on how to move a stone in the direction of sharpness and to build capacities to do that. And by the way, to then share that abstraction and that techne with other humans is a big fucking deal. And that has led to a lot of change. And that's a lot of change. Like, let's take an example. Disease. Disease is a consequence of that shift. There was very little disease, like childhood disease, like the measles, the mumps, all those things, more or less didn't exist prior to the agricultural revolution. And it was developed as a consequence of close relationship and density of population of humans and various kinds of mammals like cows and pigs and birds and whatnot. And that made a big deal. Like, that was a big deal to suddenly have disease. And to think about the developmental dents that it created when your children were just sort of spontaneously dying, and how that broke the heart in a way that just wasn't part of the developmental environment of pre-agricultural humans. And then, of course, sorry, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but we have the Upper Paleolithic transition, and then we've got the Neolithic transition, what I've been calling Game A. So these are two major transitions. And in both of those transitions, the experience of human changed a lot. And changed a lot in a way that was quite distinct from the context that gave rise to us, to our evolved humanness, our relationship with being part of connectedness to ecosystems, to life. And these changes were changes where the adaptive capacities that got us there, the adaptive capacities of just being Homo sapiens, were no longer fully responsive. So, moving past the Dunbar limit. I've talked about this. Again, this is kind of academic, but if you're interested in the story of Game A, Jim Rutt and I think had a very good conversation about that about a month ago on his podcast. Suddenly this bizarre thing of living with people that you're not physically related to, and with people who have a different developmental environment, a different culture, a different language, different beliefs, and not killing them. Well, that's a kind of a new thing. It required a lot of work and change. And so the becoming civilized involved a hammering of the bronze of human in a way that was simply out of step with what evolution had gifted us, our native capacities. And to the degree to which one was able to hammer a shape out of the steel of human that was more capable in the direction of civilization, you were more successful in the bloody game of Game A. So to be Roman was more successful than to be Greek. And in a big way, to be Roman was also to meaningfully civilize or domesticate and separate from the wildness of natural human. In fact, to be Roman was a hell of a lot better than being one of the Germanic or Celtic tribes, for a while at least.
I was gonna say, yeah.
The Germans
until it wasn't.
The Germans became Roman, and then stepped one step beyond it, and then it wasn't. Yeah. And so that's that, right? So there's the story, there's the arc or the narrative of the civilizing process and the power of harnessing and refining the capacity to create a culture that is based on the possibility of increasing our power of techne, and then creating people, really creating people. Like, that's what we do. We domesticate humans who are able to simultaneously take advantage of this power of techne and then to further it, right? So that's the co-evolutionary dynamic between identity and culture that has been the story of Game A. And it has as a characteristic increasing our power, but it also has a characteristic of being a bit damaging, and it damages our fundamental vessel, and oftentimes quite randomly, because we don't really know exactly what we're doing. I mean, the exploration of the Spartan experiment and the Athenian experiment and the Roman. I'm just doing Western civilization. We could also do the Ming experiment and the Zulu experiment. Were experiments, right? And they were trying to find solutions, but they created havoc all over the place. So, and yes, by the way, a lot of nefarious intentionality. There's a very, let's say there's wise, there's well-intentioned but naive, there's random, and there's just downright malevolent in the story of humanness. Like let's take public education as an example. There is, let's call it wise, a sense that it is in fact possible for us to do a better job at being thoughtful about how we care for the development of humans than is commonplace among most families. 1810? 1780? Yeah, that's true. Education's a real thing, and we can do a better job of it if we're thoughtful about it. And to be sure, we actually know a lot more about human development and human learning than we did back in 1530. So there's a wisdom to the capacity to become better at raising children. Well-intentioned but naive. That we actually are good at it and that we can sort of throw 30 kids in front of a teacher and try to create a curriculum and that's going to work.
Right.
And not have an enormous number of unintended consequences. And that our wisdom is actually deeply, deeply wise. That's just naive and creates all kinds of havoc. Random. Well, shit. We've got a whole bunch of people who are no longer able to work on the farms and don't quite know what to do with them, but they're all coming new into the city. We got to do something about it. Yeah. We better throw them into something else. Or, well, shit, something about the way that the economy is shifting in the 1970s, that we're beginning to move in the direction of the 2-wage household, and that really does mean that the stay-at-home mom being able to take care of the kids is kind of going away. We've got to solve that problem, where we're going to have a lot more school and more formally taking care of kids in a way that is essentially socialized. But that's random. Like, that's not really thinking about it. That's responding to a crisis with a very vague tool. Daycare. Remember daycare? Holy crap. Think about what a bricolage daycare was. And we do a lot of that. I mean, think about how oftentimes we get ourselves in a circumstance where we learn by fucking up and then step away from it. Like, just like the introduction of the automobile.
Right.
Like, wait, seatbelt, that might be a good idea. It may be a good idea to not be hurling 3,000 pounds of steel at 60 miles an hour just kind of randomly. Let's try to be a little bit more careful about it. But we evolve in the randomness. And then straight up malevolence. Oh, wow, it turns out that if I actually have the children of the entire population learning what it is that I want them to learn, I get to choose what they learn. And I'm going to be intentional about that. And I may not be endeavoring to destroy them. I may not be like truly, truly malevolent, but I'm probably not acting entirely out of their best interests. I'm biasing in the direction, let's say, of having the results be more in alignment with my interests. And those are all, I think, all at play. And they're all at play. And they're at play in variation over time, I would say. I've noticed that there are points in time where, usually after major wars, where our collective zeitgeist has a certain embodied recognition of the necessity of getting our shit straight and behaving honorably towards each other. And we kind of do a pretty good job.
Can I interrupt you right there? That's a great point. How close are we to one of those moments of recognition?
Okay, wow, that's a shift. So let me pause for a moment.
But I think that's really interesting comment that you just made, that it takes something like a war for us to step back and realize where we've been making mistakes. Is that on our horizon?
Well, let me assign the blame to someone else for a moment. There's a guy named Peter Turchin, who I met in the context of the Santa Fe Institute more than 10 years ago, like 12 years ago, maybe even 15 years ago. He's I believe, the creator of a whole discipline called cliodynamics, which is an effort to actually have the use of science to do something around, history, or how it is that events occur in the story of history. And one of the areas that he spent a lot of time, he's written a number of very good books, by the way. The Rise and Fall and Rise was one that I read a while back, but he's got a bunch. And one of the things that he was studying is precisely this question of conflict, in many different variants, by the way. And one of the things he noticed is that there does actually seem to be a certain cyclicality, and therefore predictability, to conflict, roughly 50-year cycles, actually. And so according to his model, we're sort of perfectly due. Like 2020, we should expect to see a big spike, like in the Civil War-ish zone. By ish, what I mean is like, how do I explain it? Like, if you were to grade the magnitude of the presence of conflict in a society using a whole bunch of different variables that they actually have spent time building, you can kind of measure the amount of conflict. And so while it may not be kin in the sense of, well, there's probably not going to be guys wearing gray and guys wearing blue and kind of shooting at each other with muskets, rifles with bayonets affixed in a very 19th century sense. Like, that's not what I mean. But what I mean is very difficult to not know that you're in the middle of something serious. Maybe that's a way of putting it. And quite unclear exactly what that looks like. So somewhere between what we saw in the civil rights movement, which had a spike, that was like a local spike, 65 to 73 or so, 65 to 75, and then 1865 to 1875, like those are spikes, and there was another one in the 20s, somewhere in that zone. And I imagine, actually, if you were really to double down, like really ask him, my sense is that he would be inclined to point in the direction of the 1800s rather than the 1900s as the closer example, given the characteristics of the larger environment. Let me go more into that. So, given the characteristics of the larger environment. So, for example, economic fragility. We have a level of by systemic I mean global and deep economic fragility that is a lot. We're not sitting on top of a super robust global economic system right now. We're sitting on top of a super fragile global economic system, which means both that people as individuals have both the reality and, to be perfectly frank, an unconscious feeling of risk. That some small movement could lead to a lot of people feeling like the bottom has dropped out, and that they would feel a change in the quality of their life that would feel bad to them. Globally, again. So that's one example. Another example is, well, you know what? Do you mind if I go up a level and come back down?
Not at all, sir. Okay.
So there's a model that I think I both wrote about and spoke about. No, I may not have written about it, but anyway, I'll talk about it right now. That I came up with to try to explain something that was confusing and frustrating to me in the 2008 financial crisis. So I called it the 4-layer model. And I think actually it's more like concentric circles or concentric spheres in a larger sphere, like the Earth. So from the core out. And it's probably more like 7 layers. But the surface of it, we might say, from this perspective, let's just talk about finance. So finance is on the surface. Below finance is the economy, right? So that's not that hard. In the context of finance, we have things like stock markets and money supply and derivatives and things that are financial instruments. And at least in principle, those are supposed to be anchored on top of the real economy, like people doing work and technologies embodied in factories and stuff like that. Now, in practice, they're not really, but in principle, they are. And that fact is actually an important fact. But then there's at least 2 more layers that I was wanting to point out, and I think it's useful to point out here because it's to the point. The next layer is the social, which includes like the political, but also things like journalism, so our sense-making apparatus, science, the various institutions that we use to make society operate. On top of which the economy sits, right? The economy depends on rule of law. The economy depends on functioning political institutions. The economy depends on functioning scientific institutions, right? There's a whole bunch of things there. There's almost there's a bit of verticality here. There's obviously relationships, finance affects economy affects politics, it goes up and down, but there's a certain more fundamentalness. And then below the social is the cultural. It's, the unconscious values and the implicit axiomatics and the sensibilities and the language and the assumptions that cause us to perceive the neighbor as a neighbor, and the ability to feel neighborliness towards someone, the ability to walk down the street and see a person who's an actual stranger and not be afraid of them. In fact, to be ready, willing, and able to help them and enter into a relationship with them in some way. A sense of kinship with those who are not, in fact, actually kin, right? The cultural layer. And of course, the social layer is entirely dependent on the cultural layer. You can't have rule of law when you have ethnic genocide going on. Like, those are just antithetical. And the cultural layer is more fundamental. But what we can see is that there's a way to almost like launder currency up the stack. It's not a good idea, but it can be done. So if you compare what happened in the Great Depression to what happened in the 2008 financial crisis in America, and actually comparing that to what happened in, say, Germany and Austria is quite useful. In 2008, we made the quite self-destructive and foolhardy, I would propose, choice to subsidize the financial layer at the expense of the deeper currencies. And so we debased confidence in the political system by bailing out the banks, for example. And I think anybody who paid any attention can kind of nod their head and say, yeah, I meaningfully lost trust in political institutions in how that shit was handled.
Definitely.
I didn't come out of that period of time going, man, those politicians sure have their shit together and they're honest. They're both competent and honest. I came out of it going, some combination of incredibly dishonest and incredibly incompetent, neither of which increases the currency of the political institutions. And then, of course, as we kind of moved forward in the timeline, the insistence of the political institutions to continue to go to not mea culpa and to not step into a recovery of that fact then led to the cultural level. Right, the doubling down. And here we end in 2016. Like, I can tell a story, and I feel very comfortable telling a story that 2016 was what happened when the people who lost faith in the political institutions in 2008 finally said, fuck it.
Yep.
And then what happened was the political institutions, instead of saying, yeah, you're right, gosh, we really fucked up, said, no, you're wrong.
Right.
And a culture war got ignited. So now what happened is we're now bailing out the political level, the social level, at the expense of the cultural level, right? So the fake news narrative. Instead of journalists all going, well, yeah, I apologize. We have been a mixture of comprehensive greed, self-serving mutual masturbation, and duplicitous propaganda for probably your entire lifetime. And that's really fucked up. And we're pretending to be journalists when in fact we're not. So we're going to stop and, gosh, my bad. Instead that said, no, you're wrong. You're fucked up. You're bad. You're terrible. And so, of course, culture war.
Right. Sort of like a strip mining of the culture by the finance layer.
Yes, something like that. Like very, very much something like that. So then compare that to the 1930s. In the 1930s in America, the financial layer blew the fuck up, and it hit the economic layer pretty hard. Right? We had a real live economic depression. Lots of people were out of work. We had real degradation of capital, things like that. But it didn't really hit the political layer that hard, and it actually seemed to improve the cultural layer. Like, if you go back, and obviously most of these people are no longer alive, but certainly back when I was a kid, you could have stories of people who had lived through depression, and they're like, yeah, I remember having more feeling of community then than any time since then. People came together. Communities supported each other. Neighbor helped neighbor in America. And belief in political institutions went way up. Now, we may have set ourselves up. We may have believed too much and put too much burden on, New Deal-like deep centralized government. That may have just been an error, but the belief in it was high. The confidence that I'm from the government and I'm here to help was not a complete lie was high. And then we had World War II, right, where we all pulled together. and we became a nation, and we all supported each other in a way that led to the civil rights movement in a positive way. And when people came back, there was a very strong confidence in culture. The culture was strong. And there's a strong confidence in both the competence and good faith of our social institutions. And then, of course, the economy and the financial sector kind of take care of themselves on that basis. Now, if you compare that to, say, Germany and the Weimar Republic, the financial crash led to an economic crash, which punched right through the social institutional fabric, which was weak anyway, and punched right through the cultural level and ended up with, genocide. And genocide is one of the things that tends to happen when the cultural fabric gets torn to shreds, because if we revert back to the biological level, which is below the cultural layer, right? If you go below the cultural layer, now you're in the biological layer. And the biological layer is ethnic cleansing. The biological layer is, oh, well, you and I aren't actually kin, and I can't really trust you because my biology doesn't. Right? Fundamentally, my biology doesn't trust your biology. My job is to outcompete your progeny. And the further away you are from me in kinship, the less I can trust and collaborate with you. Culture is a rare and precious thing that shifts us away from that biological mandate. And if we blow through culture, we end up in a really, truly bad place. So the context we find ourselves in is a context where we've kind of been taking very, very strong drugs for the past long time, actually, maybe even since the 70s, to be frank, to not deal with our problems. We've been on quite a bender. And a wide variety. Like, these are 8 balls. These aren't just Coke. We're not just boiling things up. We're injecting them now. And I apologize for those who may actually have a direct personal experience with people who, in fact, have had actual chemical addictions, because I know that it's pervasive as fuck and truly terrible. Yes. And so let's feel that as a real reality, and to recognize that real embodied reality is reflected in everybody else. Like, we're all addicts in some deep, deep sense to lots of different kinds of addictions. That's not a very good circumstance. And that's not a good place to start when you're ending at a point where the secular cycles of the things that Church is pointing to are pointing in the direction of more rather than less conflict. It hasn't rained for a long time, and now we're entering into the fire season. Well, let me make some predictions here.
Right.
It ain't going to be good. That's a pretty solid prediction. You're likely to have fires, and the fires are likely to burn hot. And I don't have to be a prophet to make that kind of prediction. No, it's a prediction. It's a probabilistic. It may not be. And there's 2 pieces to it. One is, oh, wait, hold on. Remember that story about the way we separated from nature? We do have the possibility of the fact that we're having this conversation. We're not just the woods. We're not just the forest that happened to be in a dry season when fire season is coming. That just has to sort of be with the fact of just raw probability. We actually have the capacity to make conscious choices in the context of our ability to perceive reality. And in fact, not only can we must. We can't help but. We make conscious choices. That's what we are. That's the aspect of nature that is now human nature. And oddly enough, magically enough, we find ourselves to the point where the story that you brought in terms of let's look backwards and let's do the process of thinking about the humanness of human nature now meets the part where we look forwards. So let me maybe complete that arc. In terms of looking backwards, let us acknowledge that the process of civilization brought us to where we are now. And as part of that process, we have done great damage to ourselves. Okay. There's no point in assigning blame. It's just where we are. We have done great harm to ourselves. So we need to heal ourselves. As individuals, like each of us as individuals have to begin healing ourselves. And that's the only way it can actually happen, because most of the stuff has to be something you choose to enter. I can't heal you and I can't force you to be healed. You have to choose to do it. I can support you once you've chosen, but that's it. So we have to heal ourselves. And that healing is going to be an individual journey, because each individual has got their own history. And it's different for me than it is for you. We can, again, help each other and support each other and give each other wisdom and perspective, but it's a very particular kind of thing. And there are people who are really, really good at supporting each other, so let me not go there. So that's one piece. And again, healing in many contexts has a kind of almost like a kind of a weakness to it. Like, oh, I broke my leg and now I need to heal. And I mean that, yes. And also, I want to harken back to the etymology of to become whole, to tune your instrument. the process of training to be a martial artist is a form of healing, is a form of learning how to bring your body into the fullness of relationship that is just your fucking patrimony. Right? It is just the inheritance of being a human is to have a body that is capable of these kinds of things. And to become aware of and to bring mind and body into perfect sync is healing. Right? So that's that movement. And that healing is one that, again, extends from the interior of yourself and the physicality of your body and its relationship with the whole of the aspects of your society of selves and your mind, and also your other relationships as a human in the family and the kinship that you actually have, your friends and relations, and then also with nature, and learning how to reconnect with and remember the benefit of the natural environment. You know, the reality that there's something about being a human in wild nature that is deeply, deeply necessary and deeply vitalizing and supports a quality of being that is this thing that we're trying to get to, that is very difficult to do in Times Square.
Right.
So that's one arc, right? But then the other side of the arc is the future, and the future pulling us forward. The ability to say, here we are. It has been a long, dry season, and the fire season is coming. Okay. Well, we happen to be that aspect of the world that has the capacity to have foresight. We happen to be that aspect of nature that makes conscious choices. Sounds like it's up to us. It's our job. That's what we're here for. So let's try it. Let's see what we can do. Let's see how we can use our capacity to be aware of what is real and to be present to what is real, to avoid it or to pretend like it's not, and then see how good we can be in ourselves and in increasingly robust and skillful relationship with others like us, other humans. And by the way, with the support of right relationship with nature, begin to actually make effective choices in this context. Can we dodge the bullet? It's almost like The Matrix. Right? There's that really interesting scene that there's a way for Neo to shift to a mode where he's actually able to dodge the bullet.
But of course, that's on a multi-generational timeline with all of our collective efforts going into this solution that none of us really knows exactly what it's going to be, but it's really, as far as I can tell, it's about feeding the system, right? It's about making yourself a functional, efficient part of the system, and then tuning the system up to eventually spit out some sort of answer. So it's like, I think it was Scott Adams who first turned me on to the idea of focus on systems and not goals. And in this case, it sounds like the system starts with taking care of yourself, taking care of your family, taking care of your community, and be healing, as you say, reconnecting with nature, reconnecting with your inner self, reconnecting with your inner strength, reconnecting with people, right? You described to me before how social media creates weak affiliations that we've replaced strong bonds that we've replaced them with. And so we need to do a lot of reconnecting, which is exactly why I reached out to you and why we created the liminal order, was to have those connections and to start with ourselves. And I know we have a limited time here, so I'm going to wrap up a few things really quick and try to hand it over to you to get your take. But they're all kind of connected. At the end of our last conversation, you said that people, as an atheist, as a non-religious person, you said that people need to become more Christ-like. And that that really stuck with me. And more than one really smart person that I know who claims to be an atheist has, what do they say to me, become the least skeptical of religion as they've been sort of in their lives. And I'm sort of sensing a trend around that. And we're not obviously going to answer that sort of right now, like why that may be the case if it is actually true. But in my mind, some of the key elements of that are service, community, giving, forgiveness, healing, as you say. And so we organize this community with the notion of service built into it. And so there's service to our fellow, it's an all men's organization, to our fellow men, and then, to the community at large, and then to our own sort of individual communities that we live in. And so we're organized around service and a commitment to self-improvement for the sake of being of better service. And you told me at the end of our last podcast that once you figure out how to take care of yourself and maybe your family, come back and talk to me. And I feel like we're making steps in that direction. And so I'd be interested just to get your reaction to some of that and just throw it out there and to say thank you also, because like I said, those conversations were really helped me crystallize a lot of my intention and what was meaningful to me and what I see as meaningful for other people. And so far, man, it's just been a wonderful experience. So there's a thank you, there's a comment, there's a question, there's a toss up. I know we got about 5 or 10 minutes here, so I'll let you carry us out with that.
Nice, thank you. Well, the first thing is that I would want to make a little bit of a correction is that, and maybe I even said this, so let me make a formal correction, that I've never really been an atheist. In fact, I've always had a perspective that atheism is just adolescent rebellion cloaking itself as sophisticated ideology.
Okay.
But I have always been quite skeptical of formal theology and formal religion. Well, first, I really like what you're saying. That feels very powerful. And what I would say is that there's something that seems like it comes next. And so that as you have learned how to take responsibility for and to care for yourself and for those relationships that are the most meaningful, the next thing that seems to come up is what we might call your calling or your vocation or that which is yours to do. The thing that you're here to carry. And I don't think that's random. I don't think that it's sort of like carry whatever the fuck happens to be nearby. Although, to be sure, pitching in and carrying, if carrying needs to happen, is a perfectly virtuous and helpful thing to do. Sometimes that just is what needs to happen. But there's something about you as an individual, the arc of your life thus far, the challenges that you have been faced with, the challenges that you have to some greater or lesser extent overcome, the capacities that you have been gifted with, and the limitations that you've been gifted with that uniquely qualify you to carry some particular piece of the larger story. And so that's the next thing. That as you have learned how to tune your instrument, and as you've learned how to practice on yourself and in those things that are the most meaningful in terms of caring, and by the way, in terms of discernment, like really getting sensitivity. As a parent, for example, being able to notice when it is appropriate to and how to support your child in her exploration of her life. That is her life. You're here to create a context that allows her to find that to her best and no more and no less. You can have that same relationship with your life. And that, I think, is the thing. And so it's, some might say, what is your purpose? And that then becomes a very powerful thing. And when you find that, as you find that, you then begin to find yourself becoming very clear on saying no to things that are not in alignment with your calling, and very able to say yes to supporting people who are very close to or are themselves connected to that in some way. And then we find ourselves in what I would call a de facto collaboration. If you're working on your calling, even if I've never met you and never shall, and I'm working on mine, then we are nonetheless collaborating on the same shared future. And if it turns out that we're side by side, then, so much the better. And we can actually collaborate more obviously. But that, I would say, is the next big thing. The next step is to use these skills and these friendships and the capacity to be checked and called out and supported in discovering and growing and challenging that happens when you've actually taken responsibility for yourself and your relationships, to then say, okay, what's yours? And by the way, get good at it.
Yeah. Well, that is certainly a lot for me to think about, and I really appreciate it. I know I'm going to go back and listen to this one a number of times again, and I have about 50,000 other questions that I could ask you, but we did agree on a hard stop coming up here, so I'm going to wrap this up. Just real briefly, do you have anything coming up on the horizon that you'd like to talk about? I know you said you're antithetical to marketing and whatnot, but is there anything that is there anything you're excited about coming up right now? Nothing. You're just enjoying the baby, doing the rounds, talking to people, working on.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's one thing that maybe we can have a conversation about in 6 weeks, 2 months. There's a project that I've been looking at for almost 15 years, and it looks like it might have a possibility of happening, which would be cool and super fun. And from my perspective, would maybe be a big piece in alignment with my calling. So it has a lot of good things to it. But I don't want to jinx it.
Yeah. No.
And it's certainly way too early to talk about it too much, but that might be an interesting thing to talk about. And, if it becomes a little bit more real, then perhaps it's exactly the right thing to talk about. In the meantime, I'm just doing the same as everybody else, making lots of mistakes, trying to learn from them, and spending a lot of time as a dad. I'd say the thing that I'm most looking forward to is going back to my parents' house over the holidays and being with my family.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for taking time out of your day to talk to us. I really appreciate it. And I will certainly follow up with you in writing and an email in the next little bit of time. And hopefully we can circle back and do this again in another few months and sort of just keep the ball rolling. I really sincerely appreciate your time. Thank you very much, Jordan.
Great. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. I thought this was great.